August 27, 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was brought up in the family of George and Auguste Gein, along with his older brother Henry. Born on January 4, 1902. In 1913, Auguste decides that life near La Crosse is too harmful for her children, and the Geins, having saved up money, bought a small dairy farm about 40 miles east of La Crosse. But in 1914, for unknown reasons, they sell it and buy another one in the vicinity of Plainfield. Plainfield was an isolated, almost unknown city to anyone. In the wilderness, the population in it did not exceed 600 or 800 people. This part of Wisconsin was impassable because of the swamps, and it was often heard that it was a great dead state. The Geins lived at a considerable distance from the city itself. When you study Gein's life, you feel his complete isolation from any human society, with the exception of their religiously fanatical mother. In the beginning, the family consisted of a father, a mother, and 2 sons. Ed's father was an alcoholic, and he was systematically out of work, which is why he was prone to violence and taking out aggression on his children and wife. The whole household was actually supported by one Augusta, who had a small grocery store. Despite the fact that Augusta despised her husband, they did not dissolve the marriage because of religious beliefs. Augusta grew up in a devout Lutheran family, whose members were fierce opponents of everything related to sex, because of which they saw only dirt, sin, and lust in everything. Religion was so important to Auguste Gein that she reduced Edward and Henry's communication with the outside world to a minimum, driving into their heads the idea that there was a lot of sin and sinful children outside, and therefore constantly forced them to do hard work on the farm and let them go only to school. She constantly read the Bible to her sons and said that the whole world was mired in vice and that all women except her were whores, and their family was blessed by the Lord himself. Augusta was a recognized authority for her sons, forbidding them to communicate with any female representatives. Ed Ross had a very contradictory feeling for his mother. On the one hand, he subconsciously idolized and revered her, seeing her as a godlike figure. But on another unconscious level, he increasingly felt resentment and hatred for her. When Hein was 10, he had an orgasm watching his mother and father slaughter a pig. Also, one day, Ed's mother caught him masturbating. For this transgression, she scalded him with a bucket of boiling water. On the 1st of April, 1940th year, the father of the family dies of cardiac arrest. During this period, Ed's older brother begins to move away from his mother more and more, demonstrating independence, seeing his future and his brother's future outside of his mother's patronage. Henry was smarter than Edward and had a clear idea of the separation of his family from society. In the period from 1940th to 1944th, Henry becomes increasingly uncomfortable under the yoke of his tyrannical mother. And not finding understanding in the house, he leaves it for a long time to search for earnings, choosing as remote locations as possible, thereby, according to assumptions, distancing himself from squabbles and violence between family members. For many years, disputes have not subsided in the psychiatric environment. Either they are born sociopaths or they become them. Personally, I think that the tense situation in Ed's house gives clear arguments in favor of making a child a maniac.
November 19th, Plainfield, Wisconsin.
What kind of person was he? Well, he was a simpleton, but it was always assumed that he was completely harmless. He was a nice guy, just like everyone else. The only thing that distinguished him from the others, in my opinion, was that he was a little. Outwardly, Edward was completely plain. His peers at school constantly bullied him. He had no friends, he was shy, but even in those moments when he tried to make friends with someone, his mother severely punished him for communicating with sinners. He had a small skin growth on his left eyelid, which was the object of ridicule from classmates. In 1942, he receives a summons to the army, but he does not pass a medical examination. Later, some of his classmates recalled that Ed was observed a number of oddities. In particular, the boy could laugh at any moment for no reason, as if he had heard some joke inside his head. Despite his difficult social development, Edward studied quite well and especially loved reading lessons. But it seemed to him that everyone in the class wished him only evil. This was due to the maternal paranoia that had become entrenched in him. In 1941, Henry begins an affair with a divorced single mother. He planned to move in with her, so he seriously began to worry about his brother. Since Augusta's influence on Edward had become stronger by that time, Henry criticized his brother's statements at his mother's several times. Although Henry tried to improve his brother's life and arrange his life in the form of part-time work with neighbors in the fields, but his mother created a web of chains of prohibitions in Ed's mind, why he did not want to go off the rails of the maternal course. According to rumors and speculation of many of the Gein's entourage, including neighbors, family squabbles became the fundamental reason for the death of Henry's older brother from Edward's testimony. On that ill-fated day on May 16, 1944, he and his brother were engaged in burning grass in a field. And at some point the fire passed to Henry and set him on fire. Edward was inclined to claim that he was confused and lost sight of his brother in the fiery mess. And he decided to find those who could come to his aid. Among those Ed was able to reach were a couple of farmers, several neighbors, and his mother. But attempts to bring help and save his brother no longer made sense. As soon as they arrived at the field, the fire went out, and going in search of the body, Ed chose the right direction. Unlike the farmers, he headed to the opposite end of the field, and immediately came across his brother's barely burned body. This raised a logical question. What happened to Henry a minute before the fire? That he suddenly, being on the opposite side of the field, could not run away from the fire. Also, at a later clarification of the circumstances, witnesses of the incidents claimed that the face and body of Gein Jr. had traces of abrasions, as if he had come out of a fight. Ed denied the guilt in every possible way, and, most likely, the testimony of witnesses could be fiction. Based on the further bloody reputation of Gein Jr., were there really signs of beatings, and can we indirectly assume that the person who took Henry's life could have been his brother? Unfortunately, we will no longer be able to find out the answer to this question. And he stayed with his mother. But the auger was outdated, and at some point in January 1945, she had a stroke. And in the end, on December 29, 1945, she died. No one came to her funeral, thereby finally expelling Gein from the society of people equal to him. He was an outcast. The Emir of Ed collapsed. It can be assumed that it is from this moment that its downward disintegration begins, which eventually brought it out of control. It is quite possible that Gein's mental state was critical, and that this was aggravated by the circumstances that came after his mother's death, when her death itself meant for him the loss of the main person of his whole life. One of the symptoms characteristic of schizophrenia is that patients are completely indifferent to their appearance. This, in particular, can be seen because it was happening inside Ed's house. When the authorities entered the house, it seemed to them that Ed had changed the garbage disposal process. Exactly the opposite, namely, he went to the landfill and took all the garbage to his home. Ed's house was a symbolic image of what was going on in his head, and in it there was complete discord and confusion. The house was the physical embodiment of this nonsense. He had radios, although he couldn't listen to them because there was no electricity in the house. He kept old dentures everywhere. There was a huge amount of chewed gum. It wasn't terrible, but it was creepy nonetheless. On the day of Gasta's funeral, Ed resolutely said goodbye to the whole past, because in this past, he was a mom's son, the subject of family violence and a loser. He boarded up the door to his mother's bedroom. Her things were stored in these rooms, and they were in the same place where she left them on her last day of life. He lived in one of the rooms and the kitchen. But despite all this, somewhere in the subconscious, the divine image of the mother has been preserved. Having accepted his loneliness, Gein seemed to feel a craving for society. The first decision was to buy a used Ford car. In 1949, he traveled a lot of roads in Wisconsin. His main entertainment is evening leisure in local roadside bars. Many people with whom he had to deal saw him as a person with oddities and a rather unusual sense of humor. They didn't exactly approve of him, but they thought it was his thing. Occasionally, Ed could draw attention to himself with stories about pirate robberies and stories about concentration camps, seasoning it with his caustic jokes. But none of those with whom he spent these evenings had any idea that all this, what he was talking about, was the whole Ed. All the spectra of his personal life can be reduced to these stories. After the death of his mother, he began to read books on anatomy with pleasure. Stories about the atrocities of the Nazis during World War II, various information about exhumation, various newspapers and magazines about various freaks, about people with deviations and oddities. He also liked to read the local newspaper, especially the obituary section. All this fascinated him. One of the brightest symbols of the culture of the 50s was a large amount of dark sexual fiction. One of the most popular trends was horror comics. Basement of Horrors, Tales from the Crypt, The Cradle of Horrors. These were stories with exciting plots, with good vivid illustrations, representing the acceptable level of violence of the graphic novel of that era. These comics were read not only by children, but also by adults. People were interested in a different life in a variety of circumstances of its manifestation. In the most incredible performance, full of pictures of everyday carnage. Of course, a lot of materials and articles were published that described the crimes of the Nazis. Terrible pictures were published, taken for the most widely read magazines such as Life and The Times. These were photos from death camps. Stories about bounty hunters from the South Seas were also admired. Stories about grave robbers of the 17th century, necromancers, resurrectionists of the dead. Gein's external data allowed him to be seen as a responsible person, because despite his physique, he could always take on the most menial work. It is difficult to imagine that in combination with its outer shell, it expressed an uncharacteristic maternal shell of its warehouse. Gein showed this trait of inner character in communicating with the children of neighbors, with whom, by the way, he spent quite a lot of time. When he was called as a nanny, they were not afraid to leave him with the children, and even for long periods of time. According to neighbors, communication with children showed other sides of behavior in him. Self-doubt faded into the background when he told the children magical stories about secret and mysterious and pagan tribes, withered heads, severed limbs, violence. All this deserved special attention and inspiration in the person of Ed. All the details that helped us get a better look at Gein's identity were made public to the local sheriff. As soon as the suspicious story with female limbs in his house became public. Personally, my opinion was that it fueled the inner world and the strangeness of Gein's vision, in which sometimes he just became obsessed with such ideas. And in the end, he decided to realize his obsession in life. He starts robbing graves. During interrogations, he will say that he started doing this about a year after his mother's death. He feels that desire and fantasies have consumed him with his head. He would go to the cemetery and dig up the corpse of a middle-aged woman, partly resembling his mother. He read obituaries and kept track of when a woman's fresh funeral was taking place. And he went to the grave when the earth was still fresh and had not settled. He dug up the coffin, opened it, and took out the body. He reburied the coffin and restored the grave to its original state. And he took the body with him to realize all his desires with him. The most important feature of Gein is that he wanted his mother back with all his might. He wanted to dig up his mother's body, but when he came to the cemetery, he found that he could not do it, because she was buried in a part of Wisconsin where the soil was too sandy, and the coffins were placed in concrete basements. He was never able to get her body out of there. But many locals and writers said that he slept with her corpse. Although it was not so curious that Sigmund Freud could confirm all his theories using the example of Ed Gein's story. Ed both loved and hated his mother because his sexual personal upbringing did not allow him to have a normal relationship with a woman. He wanted to know all the secrets of the female body through his procedures. He wanted to take away from them those parts that, in his opinion, were related to the concept of a woman. With extraordinary joy and greed, he extracted more and more new parts of the dead. He made a nipple belt for himself, cut out the genitals of women. The investigation found a box with dried vaginas. One of them was even lovingly framed in a silver frame and decorated with a small red velvet bow. He used the bones of a human shin to strengthen the coffee table. He also sawed off the top of the skull, scraped out the skull and used it as a tureen, and some skulls as coffee mugs. He stuffed chairs, armchairs, and a lampshade of human skin. He stripped the faces off the corpses and used them as masks. 5 noses were stored in a shoebox. Several lips were glued to the curtains. He made dice out of human bones. The remains, which were not useful to him, he buried either in the grave, from where he took the bodies, or on his plot. Most of all, of course, the woman's costume, sewn from different corpses, causes shock. By stitching together individual fragments of skin from various corpses, he created his perception of a woman, a la Frankenstein. As you can see, Gein was obsessed with various forms of transsexualism. Apparently, there was a part of him that aspired to become a woman. Most likely it was his personal vision of the sex change operation, which he had previously read about in the biography of Lily Elba. And that was how he saw this operation. It is obvious that he did not intend to castrate himself, but believed that he could achieve transformation by adding missing flesh and skin to his body. He dressed up in this terrible costume and walked around his house with human skin, pretending to be his mother, and conducting dialogues with himself. There was an ugly paradox in Ed Gein's mind. On the one hand, he was constantly trying to bring his mother back to the world of the living. On the other hand, it was the same woman who tormented and oppressed him more than others. And he hated her, and that's why he cut and chopped bodies and sewed skin with such fury, thereby compensating for his aggression. There was no question of any patience and accuracy. But gradually, there were not enough dead people. On November 16, 1957, he went to the hardware store. She was being held by an elderly woman, Bernice Worden. Clearly, there was something about her that attracted Gein, and it was something about her certain resemblance to his mother. Gein went to the store the day before the tragedy, asking about the prices of antifreeze. The next day, Gein came to the store and began to inspect the guns. He asked to see one of them, took out some cartridges prepared in advance, loaded, and shot Bernice in the back of the head. Do you remember hitting or shooting her? No. Something came over me. Antifreeze was taken out. It's hard for me to say now. My memory about all this is vague. But I do remember dragging her across the floor. I remember loading her body into a truck. Then he drove to the intersection at 51st 73rd in the direction of East Plainfield. The truck parked near the Pines, then went into town and picked up his car, returned to the place where the truck was parked, loaded the body into the trunk, threw the cash register there as well. I took the cash register with me when I took out her body. After that, he went to his farm, pulled the body out of the car, and, taking it by the legs, dragged it to his shed. Tell us how the blood was drained and where it was put, as well as whether you used a homemade knife to disembowel it. This is close to how I remember it. It was like I was in a kind of daze, so I can't swear that it was like that. Then you said that you drained the blood and took it out and buried it next to the toilet booth. East of the booth. Do you remember what exactly the blood was taken out in? In a bucket, in a basin, in a jar. It must have been a bucket. Which one? Well, this galvanized bucket. So after that you went and skinned the body. You said you thought you were butchering a deer. That's the only explanation I can think of. The interviewer also asked Ed a question about cannibalism, asking him if he intended to eat meat in the order. However, he was evasive and complained of memory problems. On the same day, Bernice's son Frank returns from hunting. Entering the store, he is horrified to discover a huge number of bloodstains. After the police arrived, the sheriff asked if Frank had any suspects. Frank called Gein's name because there was a detailed check in his name on the cash register. On the evening of the same day, Gein was arrested near a grocery store. It is also important to mention that Judge Robert Glomer's book mentions the fact that the sheriff had already searched Gein's house before. But at that moment, no evidence was found. Gein himself will tell about this in his last interview. I saw Ed Gein sitting in the car. There was a light on at the door of the store, and I could see him. One kid from the store was sitting with him. I walked up to his car and said, "Eddie, I'd like to talk to you." Eddie came over and sat in the back seat of the car with the spider written off. I asked Eddie to tell me where he was from 6 in the morning until now. He started his retelling, and then I said to him, "Now let's go back to the shop in Worden. Say it again." When he finished his new retelling, I say, "Eddie, you're telling a completely different story." Eddie blinked. "Someone set me up." I asked why you were framed. He said, "Well, Mrs. Worden." "What about Mrs. Worden?" "But she's dead, isn't she?" "Dead." "How do you know she's dead?" "I've heard about it." "And where did you hear that from?" "I heard them talking about it." Even then I understood. We got him. Rumors spread very quickly, so Gein had to be brought to a place of temporary detention on the floor of a car, as there was a danger of encountering violence from the residents of the city. The Washoe County Sheriff's Department was ordered to search the suspect's home. Two police cars headed by the sheriff went to Gein's farm. The first place they entered was the summer kitchen adjacent to the house. Having knocked out the door, the police began to inspect the premises. They began to illuminate the room with flashlights and search. Then one of the policemen stumbled upon something and sent a beam of light there. Bernice's half-disemboweled body was hanging there. Mrs. Borden was undressed, her body was opened and completely gutted, as hunters usually do with roe deer. Her head was cut off at shoulder level. Gein cut the skin on the back of her ankles and inserted a 3 to 5 foot long wooden stake with a diameter of about 4 inches, sharpened on both sides. We noticed that there were only a couple of drops of blood on the dirty floor under the body. It became obvious that the body had been disemboweled elsewhere. The head and entrails were not there. We continued to examine the house. It was in a neglected state. Bones, paper, garbage, fragments of clothing, barrels, and so on were scattered all over the floor. We went up to the second floor, which surprisingly was not as cluttered as the first floor. A human skull was found in a box there. Someone suggested that it could belong to Mary Hogan, who disappeared in 1954. Marty found an automatic revolver under the pillow in Gein's bedroom. He would later be identified as the murder weapon of Mary Hogan. A plastic bag containing a decomposing head was found behind the bedroom door. Skulls were placed on the edges of Gein's bed. A box containing 4 severed noses was also found in the house. What kind of individual could have created something like this? I had a feeling that I had never experienced in my entire life because I had never seen such a thing before. It was just awful. We found skulls and masks made of human skin, which were packaged in plastic bags. We found a box containing female organs. I noticed that they were tied with a gold-colored ribbon. We found leg bones and found a chair with human skin stretched over the seat. Everything was tightly tightened, but if you looked under the bottom, you could see strips of fat. There were also legs with handles that were made of bones, lamps made of leather, bowls made of skulls, and a nipple belt. One of the most bizarre finds is a costume made of skin parts of a female torso and waist. The costume also had a terrible addition in the form of a vagina and anus neatly sewn on the sides. Gein said he wore this costume at night and danced in his yard. There was a paper bag outside the kitchen door. I picked it up with one hand. It was difficult. It's hard to see what was there. Some kind of hair. When I pulled it out and dedicated it with a flashlight, Marty took the mask in his hand and said, "My God, this is Mary Hogan." But where is the head, Mrs. Worden? She was nowhere to be seen. We decided to look more carefully in the summer kitchen. There were 2 mattresses stacked on top of each other. When we lifted one edge, we saw a bag. It was in him that we found the cherished head. Nails were driven into the ears, curved in the shape of hooks. Pieces of rope were tied to them. No one knows exactly what Gein's plans were for this monstrous trophy. Maybe he wanted to nail it to the headboard of his bed or to the wall in the living room. In the kitchen. We found a coffee can in the kitchen. It contained chewing gum. And it would be fine if there was one, but there were about 200 of them. Gein didn't seem to be throwing anything away. By the way, during the interrogation, Gein necessarily had a break for chewing gum. In addition to gum, cracked and yellowed dentures were displayed on the shelves like Faberge eggs, and sand was visible in the sink. During the search, we also found a shoe box containing 9 carved wolves. One of them looked particularly fresh. A closer inspection revealed that Gein was salting them. There was a frying pan with Mrs. Worden's heart on the kitchen stove. There was a glass filled with antifreeze nearby. There was a book on medicine in the living room. Surprisingly, the pages were clean except for two, where the head and female genitals were depicted. The only room in the house that was different from all the others was Gein's mother's room. It was boarded up. Everything was dusty inside, but there was no mess. The night search was long and exhausting. By that time, it had started to rain outside, and then snow. Working with Gein was not easy. He didn't fully understand where he was or what was going on at all. The commission of crimes was recognized in different ways. Sometimes he insisted on an accident, tried to please the interlocutor during the interrogation, tried to absolve himself of guilt, and justify his actions. Gein denied that his trophies' faces and heads, vulvas and breasts, noses and lips, skin and bones that littered his infernal dwelling were the remains of murder victims. He insisted that he was not a mad maniac, that Mrs. Worden's death was an accident. When asked if he had taken anyone's life other than Beatrice, Eddie shook his head and added, "Not to my knowledge." What do you think of Mrs. Worden? I liked her. In that sense. She was cute. I thought she looked like my mother. Her growth and everything else was the same. Even her cheekbones were very similar. Did you feel the same way about Mary Hogan as you did with Beatrice? It's true. How did you feel? Every time I visited her, she was always friendly and welcoming. Yeah. What did Mary Hogan have in common with your mother? But this is friendliness, and thinking about it now, I believe that she had the same height, and everything in general is the same. Could you take Mary and put her in a coffin already occupied by another woman? I could have. Gein informed Vilmovsky that between 1950 and 1954 he had dug up 9 or 10 bodies from 3 different cemeteries. Gein said, "You see, I didn't take all of them, I put some of them back." He also said that sometimes he just cut out the parts he needed and didn't take the bodies. The Geins were interrogated in the case of the disappearance of several other girls. However, he denied involvement in them. At the trial, Gein will tell that he has never hunted deer because he was afraid of the sight of blood. However, neighbors testified to the contrary. More than once he offered them to take venison from him. It didn't help that Gein had eviscerated Miss Worden in cold blood. You told me you were removing some parts of the flesh, right? Yes. What parts of the flesh did you remove? The head. What about the vagina? Well, it's not always. When the head was removed, you first cut through it and then broke it off. I think I just broke it off. It turns out that you loosened it from side to side and then separated it like, say, a piece of wire into 2 parts. You have described this well. I never took a saw with me when I went to the cemetery. Just so you understand, while recording this transcript, Gein was eating a piece of apple pie with cheese on top, and complaining that the cheese was dried up. Volmovsky also interviewed Gein about his thoughts on sex. Have you ever thought about removing your penis and having female genitals instead? Well, this is partly true. And which part is true? That I would like to remove a part of myself. Does this part mean your penis? But, not really. I mean, I wanted to do this earlier, when I was a minor. Eddie, here you had such thoughts to take some part from women, mainly the vagina, and hold it at your penis to cover it. I think it's true. Do you recall doing anything similar with vaginas from those women's bodies? That's what I think. Yes, I remember. It's true. Were there any similarities between those faces and your mother? I think there was such a thing. What about the faces? Did you dress the faces on your own? That's what you did, right? I'm sure of it. Parts like the eyes, these parts of the head. There should be only parts of the head itself, and there should be them. 2 or 3. Well, do you remember how you kept the faces on top of yours? It seems to me. With a cord. Do you think you would wear this other face for a long period of time? Not too long. I had things to do after all. I think an hour or so. Have you ever put women's underwear on top of your body, and then put one of those vaginas on top of your penis? It's possible. So you separated the skin from the skull, and got rid of everything that was inside the head, is that right? And so it is. What about the preparation of the flesh? From a piece of this skin? Maybe. You know, I mean that woman. I used oil. This is so that the skin remains soft. You know. What kind of woman is this about? The one that was missing the upper part, and the one that Miss Adams. All right. What kind of oil did you use? Penetrating oil. Did you wear rubber gloves? With Mary Hogan, it seems there was such a thing. Do you think it looks like an unfolded chest? That's right. Are they from Mary by any chance? It seems so, as far as I remember. How were scalps taken? Did it? A pocket knife with a big blade like that. These skulls. I wanted to use them as containers. I think you got my idea right. I think it's like the old Norwegian style. Those old songs they used to sing, they must have used skulls to drink. What was the name of this drink? Mead. So what kind of waste basket is it made of? It's made of human skin. It seems this thing is made of a leg. Or maybe one of the two. Did you sew them in 2 places? It's like from the one from the grave. What about masks and faces? When I made these masks, you see, I stuffed them with paper so they could dry. On the vagina well, you know, I sprinkled a little salt on it. She started to turn green. Why did you paint this particular vagina in silver aluminum paint? Yes. And I painted the top with paint to see if it would stay that way. Did you open the coffins completely or only half? Half of it. And then they pulled out the body. That's right. Gein was asked if anyone had come to the cemetery while he was there. He said that it really happened once. He stressed that they were lovers. He ducked and stayed in the grave. He was sure that he had not been noticed. He also stressed that at that moment he felt a pleasant excitement while digging up the grave. The judge said that Gein likes older girls. More formed, that is, dead. Ed officially has only 2 murders on his account. Well, at least, which we know about and which we were able to prove. Bernice Varden and the owner of a local bar, Mary Holland, who went missing under very strange circumstances. During the investigation, it was established that Mary was killed in a bar. Cartridge casings were found, as well as streaks of blood stretching to the door. The case of Mary Hogan's disappearance happened on December 8, 1954. But before the murder of Bernice, due to the passage of time and the lack of new information, this crime was never solved. During interrogations, Gein even joked that Mary Hogan was hiding on his farm, which initially no one took seriously, attributing it to the manifestation of Ed's not very healthy sense of humor. But during the search, the deputy sheriff came across a paper bag. Opening it, he took out a face cut off from his head by a tuft of hair, in which he and the others immediately recognized Mary Hogan. In the 50s in America, and especially in small towns, people were not ready and unable to believe what was happening, and learn about the horrors happening right under their noses. What happened couldn't have been done by a human. Only the devil could be capable of this. The fact that Ed was robbing graves struck the deeply religious population of the city much more than the murder, due to the fact that it touched in them very, very much the most primitive strings of the soul and personality. It didn't fit in their heads that the bodies of their loved ones were being bullied in this way. Unlike many personalities associated with serial crimes and perversions, Ed had no dependence on the material things surrounding him. This is perfectly shown by one of the cases on his farm, where unidentified persons broke out the windows and started a fire. His family farm completely burned down. All that Gein could squeeze out of himself in response to what happened, it's for the best. This proves to us his complete renunciation of everything that surrounded him. There is also an interesting fact in Gein's biography. A businessman who was trying to organize a horror attraction at the Gaines house began to conduct excursions among state tourists there. This is a very interesting demonstration of the American streak, and how Americans are trying to capitalize on the reputation of terrible monsters like Gein. Plainfield was a tiny town in the middle of the state, cut off from any civilization. Even in the state of Wisconsin itself, they have not heard of the existence of such a city. But suddenly, thanks to Ed Gein's crimes, the city got a terrible fame. Dozens of reporters poured into the city. The news of the crimes was a bomb. In the end, Gein got on the front pages of Life, which at that time was incredible. And then there was a huge article in the Times. This testified to the extraordinary interest in Gein's personality. And there were those who were in a hurry to take the opportunity to put their name in the newspaper and give an interview, to speak out on the topic to Gein, and say that they always knew everything about him, and to sell their photo. But Plainfield's sound social sense was outraged by the terrible wounds inflicted by Ed. For every small town had its own small, but reason to be proud of itself. For example, the fact that one or another celebrity was born in it. But Plainfield immediately became the city where the ghoul Ed Gein was born. There is something not so widely known that the term serial killers came into use many years after these horrific events. Most serial killers are insane, but they understand what they're doing, and they're damn rational. It can be said that they have their own terrifying code without any moral and human values. Without a shadow of compassion, looking for only objects in people that could be used for their perverted purposes. It is impossible to feel any sympathy for Spivsav or John Gacy. They were monsters. And even despite the fact that Gein, thanks to his terrible practice, was recognized as a monster, complete and absolute. But there were also people with a kind heart who felt a sense of pity and compassion for him. Having not previously experienced any kind of torment, creatures of the Gein type appear and develop into a final form quite rarely. Gein was not schizophrenic in the everyday sense of the term. Schizophrenia manifests itself at the age of 12. Gein was practically normal until he was 39, until the period when his mother died. And only after that begins the chain of his cruel antics. As it turns out at the forensic psychiatric examination later, he was abnormal, which meant that his mental state was quite painful. He was constantly experiencing various auditory, tactile, and visual hallucinations. For example, when 4 or 5 hours he could run from the floating head of his mother, who screamed at him and cursed, while Ed crawled through bushes and forests just to hide. Further, some pathological features of childhood and upbringing were revealed. The inability of a person to develop normally socially and sexually. In many serial killers, there is a small child who acts under the influence of an instant impulse. Both society and civilization are called upon to take care of them and cure them. But no one did it. In addition to the fact that there were facts and sexual satisfaction behind the crimes. Many murderers experience the highest peak of satisfaction at the moment of killing their victim. Murder can be called an extreme way of obtaining an extreme degree of pleasure. Well, and the deprivation of someone's life. Types like Ed Gein have a fascinating effect on us. This is due to the fact that it is impossible to resist them. Their crimes are so terrible that our consciousness simply does not accept them. Probably, they touch some primitive strings of our souls. Primitive, if you like, or instinctive. This becomes the plot for classic legends and fairy tales. Everyone knows that in different parts of the world, there are special folk tales in folklore, called stories about murderers. These are fairy tales or tales about places, caves, forests, houses where you can never go. No way, under any circumstances. And in each of these bloody nooks and crannies, eventually, a room will be discovered where dismembered bodies are hung on hooks. This is the victim of one monster or another, and it looks like you will be the next victim. After all, he is already standing at your front door, and you forgot to close it again when you came home. Ed Gein was a ghoul and immediately became a character of new folklore and new myths. His image turned into various forms. These were low-grade jokes, such as, What kind of candy does Ed Gein like most ladies' fingers? And what did Ed Gein say to the sheriff when he handcuffed him? My heart is now with you in a bag. It wasn't funny, but there were jokes like that in the 50s in Wisconsin. There was something clingy about this story that made me want to talk about it again and again. And just so you understand, there is a whole chapter in the judge's book about Eddie Gein called Humor in a Gein Way. In it, among other things, it was written, residents of all ages were not averse to joking. For example, before the Christmas holidays, it was possible to hear children singing this song. In the pre-Christmas night, in the silence of the mute, there is no one in the school hall, not even a donkey. Troublesome for the neck of the teacher hanged. They are waiting for the arrival of Ed Gein. For example, the book Psychosis of the famous writer Robert Bloch, who in the 50s was just living in Wisconsin, when the story of Gein was thundering. And if you've read Psychosis, you'll remember that after Norman Bates was arrested, people compared him to Ed Gein. The character of Norman Bates, created by Bloch, is much closer to Gein than the image of Hitchcock shown. Bloch himself said that many believed that the novel was entirely based on a real-life serial killer Eddie Gein, whose life served to give birth to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. However, the novel had an indirect relation to the life and crimes of Gein. However, Bloch himself talked about it. The first Psychosis was based on the situation. At that time, I didn't know much about Gein himself. I knew that he lived in a small town with a population of 800 inhabitants. I myself lived 50 miles away, in another small town of 1,200 people. And I understood that this was the case when you sneezed in the northern part of the city, and from the south comes be healthy. And so I knew that a certain person had committed some monstrous murders in a small town. He lived in it all his life, and no one suspected him of anything. This was the situation that made it possible to think that there was a story behind it. Based on this story, I wrote a novel. It was only after the image of Norman Bates was invented that I found out how close he was to the real Ed Gein. This once again highlights how our sick imagination can simulate an ideal situation. The coincidence of dreams of desires and reality, as Nabokov wrote about Lolita, when he was reproached for coinciding with real events. Bloch wrote to more novels Psychosis. When asked why he did it, he replied, "The world has changed." At the time when I wrote the first Psychosis, serial murders were extremely rare. It was anomalous, exotic if you will. Today, this is a common thing. You open the newspaper, turn on the TV, and learn about the monstrous victims of another killer. It's happening everywhere, all over the country, all over the world, on the streets and in schools. And I wondered, what would happen if Norman Bates returned to today's violent world? What should he think about the new world, and what should the world think about him? Hitchcock, for obvious commercial reasons, invited a well-known and attractive artist to play Norman. But according to the book, Bates is a man over 40, with receding hairline, plump, and not too attractive. But Hitchcock, creating his Bates, sought to show us not a man from the gray mass. And taking on this role Anthony Perkins, whose appearance did not coincide at all with the image of Bates, he created a new maniac. Attractive. It was the creation of an icon. It was the image of a nice neighbor who greets you in the morning, with whom you ride in the elevator in the morning, when you walk your dog. Psychosis came out in the 60s, but the film no longer conveyed the spirit of Gein, because the book was imbued with a tough mood of overwhelming puritanism, and the vulgar interest of various dirty reading material flashing against this background. This very schizoid element, part of the Gein case, was used by Bloch and Hitchcock to create Psychosis. The film was shot for 36 days. Also, the film industry gave birth to the Bates Motel series, which is indirectly related to the story of Gein, but still. It is a very high-quality good series. A completely different view of the history of psychosis. As for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it has done a great and global job. She awakened the atmosphere of the crypt reigning in the House of Gein. This horror and nightmare, pure and simple. The power came from here, because we are not able to find the meaning in this. It is impossible to imagine such a family of cannibal murderers in our minds. They can't exist, but now you see them real, they are standing in front of you. And somewhere in the subconscious, we feel a slight compassion for the Leatherface. This is a self-identity that we can experience by looking at more or less normal monster faces. Like Norman Bates played by Perkins. The Leatherface family is an extreme parody. A movie or comic book is a device of a pathological family. It is firm this that we feel sorry for the Leatherface because we are able to imagine in what environment it appeared. The Silence of the Lambs borrowed the same suit of human skin. Both in the film and in the book, we observe Buffalo Bill, who partially repeats Gein's crime and motivation, in the form of transformation into a woman. And to be honest, the works of cinema do not end there. But they can be enumerated endlessly. Therefore, now you have on the screen those films that are considered to be directed by directors, screenwriters, actors. These works were inspired by the story of Ed Gein and everything that happened in his house. You can familiarize yourself and choose a movie for yourself. And one more rather important point worth mentioning. The way Ed Gein influences the culture of the modern world. Here is a picture of one of the most famous American artists outsider art, Joe Coleman. Coleman is known for painting about serial criminals. Ed is one of them. The artist himself has studied Gein's life in detail. If you look closely at a couple of centimeters of his panel, you can see the covers of horror magazines that Gein read. The image is filled with quotes from both police officers and religious texts. The edges of the painting refer to illustrations of the Dance of Death, and the text with holes is an expanded version of a humorous children's song about Eddie Gein. As Coleman notes, he feels a certain connection with Gein, including maternal complexes and an obsession with collecting various criminal and grotesque artifacts. One of these artifacts is a letter from Gein himself from the hospital. Ed Gein really looks like a shaman. Gein plunges into the dark corners of his psyche and explores the darkest parts of his own soul associated with necrophilia. Transgenderism. He wears the skin of a woman and simultaneously connects with his mother and connects with the dead. He does it alone with himself. He arranges midnight masses, decorates his house with homemade grotesque artifacts like totems of totem gods. Since there would have been a shaman, and in a similar crazy way he reflected the traumatic times that the tribe was going through. Gein reflects for us, daughters, what our metaphorical tribe is going through with you. The dark culture of our life. Just like, for example, Albert Fish. And there is a certain irony in this, as a serial killer becomes a folk hero. These people commit crimes that we are not capable of committing ourselves. Step over the taboo of norms and blocks of morality. But still, we are able to imagine such a thing, because everyone has criminal thoughts. But we differ in that we are not perfect. A virtuous person dreams of what the villain brings to life. Sigmund Freud. These people have stepped over fantasies inside themselves, prejudices. This is what attracts us in an extraordinary way. This, of course, is quite exaggerated, but such people personify for us a certain freedom of personality. The basis of the character of any person. They violate established laws, and that's why most are so intrigued by them. Gein becomes the embryo of a psychopath of a new time, a new era, and not a creation that haunts us in childhood fears. They penetrate into us through the most primitive channels of consciousness. To peel the skin off a human face and put it on your own is one of the most painful actions in human history. And as long as our attention is attracted and our eyes are focused on him, there will be a place for Ed Gein in world history. After his arrest in November 1957, he was subjected to forensic psychiatric examinations. At the same time, when Edward Gay was in the hospital for examination, he testified about how he dug up the graves of his victims, and the investigation authorities began to check his words. Confirmations have been found. The graves were indeed exhumed by Gein's hands. Some of the women's bodies in them were known to Edward. during their lifetime. There was no point in continuing the check further. It became obvious that the testimony was honest, and a sufficient amount of evidence was collected to prove this. In the conclusion of the psychiatric examination of the 6th of January, 1958th year, caused the deepest resonance. Edward Gein was recognized as a person suffering from schizophrenia and having sexual perversions. His homosexuality combined with necrophilia, according to doctors, also confirmed that Gein could not appear at the sentencing, but should continue treatment in a psychiatric hospital for an unspecified period. I feel that Mr. Gein is suffering from long-developing chronic schizophrenia. In addition, I cannot say that he is able to consult with his lawyer. I think he's legally insane. Mr. Gein is not an imbecile or mentally deficient person. However, he suffers from a chronic mental illness. But still, he can cooperate with his lawyer, and therefore, he is legally sane. In other words, doctor, you are trying to say that from a medical point of view he is insane, but from a legal point of view, he is sane. Is that what you're trying to say? Yes. Based on the diagnosis of the doctor's analytics and the acts committed by him, it becomes clear that Ed will not return to his former life. And it was decided to establish compensation for the families of victims at the hands of Gein. It was decided to do this with the help of an auction that took place on the 30th of March, 1958th year, where all of Edward's things were sold in general, reading about how he kept himself in the hospital. You might think that a feeling of regret was not given to him. But a little later, you will see that this is not the case. The hype around Gein began to subside. As isolated for life from society, he began to disappear from the media reports. New heroes have appeared. But after 5 years from the day of his imprisonment in the clinic and the republication of his deeds, a group of journalists became interested in him and, in conjunction with the local authorities, their idea was to show the conditions of detention of Ed and himself to citizens. Ed was introduced to the public at the end of November 1962nd year. Clean, shaved, well-fed. He looked like an ordinary average citizen with an absolutely stable psyche. And it was hardly possible to see a bloodthirsty maniac in his face. Gein was strikingly different from the man who got into the hospital and, according to the doctors, did not cause them any inconvenience. Despite the fact that Ed was paraded to a large audience, Gein was pleasantly surprised by such attention, as evidenced by his active desire to cooperate with reporters and share how he is being treated. It was obvious how pleased he was that here he could practice his favorite carpentry, which was part of his therapeutic leisure. On November 7, 1968, Edward Theodore Gein was convicted after a fairly long treatment and an up-to-date diagnosis. We saw that Gein's mental state was normalized, and he was aware of what was happening, and of the crimes he had committed. When I expressed my desire to talk to Gein, Dr. Schubert told me that Gein refused to talk to reporters and others, but he would ask him if he would like to meet with me. To my surprise, he agreed. He looked fuller than I remembered him. He was friendly, smiling and laughing throughout the interview. I was asked to write a book about your case, and actually now I'm doing it. I have all the old transcripts and stuff. I thought it would be nice to come here and talk to you. You don't have to, but I'd like to know if there's anything you'd like to talk about. Is there anything you would like to say for the book? Well, I think a lot has flowed since the sheriff died. I think you're aware that all of this has been hidden. He died, and the deputies came out with all the facts naked. As far as I know, on the night of your arrest, when you were taken to prison, the sheriff hit your head against the wall. Is it true? This, of course, was not very good on his part. In addition, I was kept awake that night, as well as half of the next day. Interrogations and all that sort of thing. They asked about this and that. It was just like old times. They used this third degree or whatever it's called. Perhaps the only thing they didn't use then was this lamp with a bright light to shine into my eyes. I remember when you were in Madison, you were fed. I remember the moment when they brought you an apple pie with cheese on top, and then you said that it was dried up. Do you remember that? Ah, yeah. They also had pumpkin pie there. But I didn't really care about them. Ed, someone told me, or I think I read it somewhere, that from the moment you are here, you have started making some jewelry out of stones. Are you really doing this? I really used to do this. Now I work as an electrician. I was at Dr. Schubert's house. I've been working on everything there. Everyone in Usher County has always referred to you as a good hard worker. Well, my jewelry was sold all at once by volunteers for $50. I made some nice jewelry that cost $100. Silver bracelets and everything like that. But it was all sold for $50. Do you still make such jewelry? Not anymore. Now I work as an electrician, carpenter, repair roofs, and all the like. Those crafts that you created, are they all sold? That's right. Each cost at least $100. Then I also help the guys from below with the carpet. Why did I take it upon myself to help these guys and show them how everything is done? I could sew carpets. How old are you? 65. You're a boy compared to me. I'm 70. You beat me by a whole 5. How is your health? Are you all right? Honestly, it's true. Well, tell me, in general, how do they treat you well? Not only with you, but in principle with all patients. Are you well fed? The food is good, everything else is good too. Do you miss the neighborhood, OSHA? No, not really. Were you happy while you lived there, Ed? Well, I don't think it could be called a happy life. I had a lot of debts. I had to work hard to pay them. That's when I started the house. I lived in constant tension. I've been meeting with your old friends from the Hill recently. Do you remember them? Of course. Mrs. Hill told me that the last time you had dinner with them, you then played checkers with one of her boys. Maybe. I don't remember now. Well, is there anything else you would like to say for my book about this case? There is. You probably remember that the sheriff said that he was at my house and looked at everything there, like even with his other guys. And he didn't find anything. Remember? Yes. You know I wasn't there, and I can prove it. I was in the hills. I've been with them all this time. And that's a bit puzzling, right? They search my house and they don't find any evidence. And then, when they search everything again, they immediately find everything. And yet I wasn't there. Of course, it was dark, it was night, and they didn't have flashlights, so they couldn't conduct a search. But they also had to have flashlights for a proper search. Did you have electricity on your farm? No. And they showed up there without a search warrant, although they had to get a search warrant first. Do you still read a lot? Yeah. Interesting things, newspapers. And I'm following the latest developments. Some guys neglect this. They don't even read newspapers. But you need to know what's going on in the world, and how. You know that. I listen to the news on the radio. There's a shortwave here, so I can find out what's going on in the world. But you still read a lot, right? Well, I read what is educational, interesting. But there's a lot of fiction that I can't stomach. It is good for children, but not for an adult. You have an expensive library there, right? Right? That's right. Well, thank you for agreeing to talk. I will transfer our entire conversation into a book. And I am sure that there will be many pleasant visits to you and to Dr. Ant in the next few years. After the publication of these data, the investigation received the green light to continue the trial in the cases of the deaths of two women. But because of Ed's sentence, he was returned to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, as the court took into account that the crimes were committed due to a severe mental disorder. Gein decided to file an appeal with regard to the sentence imposed on him with a request to be recognized as mentally sane. After a long review, the application was rejected in April 1974 year. Subsequently, a very curious item appeared in Ed's medical history. The attending staff of the Institute of Mental Disorders told that Ed behaved very strangely in the presence of women. The older Gein got, the more it manifested itself. He could get confused and fall into stupor at the sight of representatives of the opposite sex. Edward Theodore Gein met his last day on the 26th of July, 1984 year. He died of asphyxia. At the stages of treatment, he was diagnosed with leukemia of the blood. Gein was buried on July 28 next to the grave of his mother Augusta Gein. For a long time, his tombstone was destroyed because of souvenir hunters. In the 2000th year, most of the tombstone was stolen. In June 2001, the tombstone was restored. Well, now let's talk about the mental status of Edward Theodore Gein. Ed is probably the worst example of greenhouse cultivation of mental disorders. It demonstrates the fact that there are only acquired mental disorders, not hereditary ones. First of all, he was the youngest child. Usually, the maximum attention of parents is concentrated on the younger ones. But only such children are most often taken care of and pampered. But in the understanding of August and Gein, pampering meant strictly educating, torturing, and imposing the dogmas of the church. And what is important, their personal beliefs and interpretation of religious writings, in the form of fornication and sin of the surrounding world, and that the only bulwark of security is where his mother is. It was not for nothing that I mentioned the ambivalent attitude towards mother hatred and idolatry of the guest Gein, who represented for Ed the only image of a sinless woman. With this, she completely shut up his personal and, importantly, sexual development. We all get to know our sexual identity when we understand our gender, that there are representatives of the opposite sex with genitals different from ours, and the understanding that we experience sexual arousal for certain genders, and complete all this with the first masturbation act, and then with a normative coitus. But things went wrong for Gein on all fronts. The shackles and labels hung by her mother caused a complete misunderstanding of herself and the world around her. The first excitement for the slaughtered pig after the first masturbation was poured with boiling water. Sympathy for women was replaced by phobias for women, and the understanding of one's gender slipped to complete latency and asexuality. Ed's brother, on whom the influence of his mother did not extend so much, was able to develop normally and almost broke out, even having a relationship. And he would have been able to get his brother out of this bondage, but the accident and his death left no chance for gain. And then the loss of the main deity in the form of a mother. And then the domino effect begins in the form of the collapse of all the structures of existence. I remind you that at the time of Agast's death, he was 39 years old. A very stagnant period of self-knowledge. And then there is no time for masturbation in a circle in kindergarten. But books on anatomy, comics, and short stories filled in his gaps and interest in understanding gender, body structure, the interaction of men and women. By the way, what is important, his underdevelopment is very well characterized by the fact that he perfectly communicated with children and always found a common language with them, telling and interesting them when he acted as a nanny. But in the understanding of a man and a woman, he did not dream of such an interaction as you thought about. He dreamed of dismemberment, burning at the stake, digging up corpses. That's the kind of relationship he read about. And they seemed normal to him. And the obsession to get his mother back had taken over his brain. From that moment on, he begins to plunder the graves of elderly women. At the same time, mind you, he is also engaged in the study of anatomy, as well as the venting of negativity towards his mother, and the creation of a collection, and that very suit of himself ideal, protecting him from his mother. For he is his mother. And in it he attains harmony with himself. But time passed, and there were not enough bodies, and the plan must be carried out. And do you remember, I told you about his insensitivity at first glance? No, it's something else. The only two murders he committed had no underlying sexual or fetishistic interest. He just needed skin, to complete his work. He even killed them like deer on a hunt, with a direct shot to the back of the head, so as not to spoil the skin. And remember the method of dismemberment again, as some kind of deer or roe deer, so that the blood flows down. And even when he was caught, he wasn't nervous, because he didn't care much about it. Everything around him was unreal. Exactly from the moment his mother left him, his world collapsed like a house of cards. And the disease was pressing harder hallucinations, voices, fears. From this, when he was informed that the house had burned down, and all his work, too, he was completely unmoved. Today you are really looking at a mentally deranged serial killer who is not able to answer for his actions. Unlike everyone else I told you about earlier, he has clearly diagnosed schizophrenia with sexual perversions, which were influenced by 3 types of sexual pathologies at once. Gein was a latent homosexual, a necrophile, and a transsexual. All these perversions interacted, and it is very difficult to understand them in their mutual conditionality, because it is simply impossible to trace it in the absence of any objective biographical data of life. Him and his loved ones. But what is important, he did not rape the corpse, and he did not eat the body. This is a very important aspect, because sexually he was stuck somewhere on the verge of 5 to 8 years. And he didn't need sex, and he didn't even know how it was. But curiously, his mother stayed with him forever. For even at the end of his life, being in a comfortable environment and conditions, he was completely afraid of the fair sex. And his house was filled with the remains of 15 women, like totems repelling evil spirits.